Welcome to Flash News. Japan turns away from post-World War II pacifism as China threat grows. Tokyo. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is a man on a mission. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, he has imposed sanctions on Moscow, agreed to pursue a nuclear-free world with the Pope, and taken a diplomatic tour of Southeast Asia and Europe to rally world leaders to protect democracy. But it's not just democracy in Ukraine that he's trying to protect. Kishida sees parallels between Russia's actions in Europe and China's expansion in the Indo-Pacific, a region stretching from America's Pacific coastline to the Indian Ocean. "We strongly oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force, regardless of the location," said Kishida, in a joint statement with European Union leaders in May. The same statement included a clause expressing serious concern about reports of militarization, coercion, and intimidation in the South China Sea, though it didn't name China as the aggressor. Japan's location places it in an increasingly volatile security environment, flanked by China to its south, nuclear-armed North Korea to the west, and Russia to its north. As a result, the war in Ukraine has catalyzed debates on Japan's national security like never before. In April, members of the country's ruling party submitted a proposal to raise the country's defense budget from 1% to 2%, in line with NATO members, and develop counterattack capabilities, a move that heralds big changes for Japan's long-standing pacifist security stance. But Tokyo is not only investing in its defense, it's using diplomacy to strengthen its relationships in the region and beyond. Ahead of Kishida's meeting with United States President Joe Biden on Monday, experts say the world's third-largest economy is reevaluating its approach to deterrence and showcasing itself as a reliable partner on the world stage. A Japanese invention. Japan floated its idea of an arc of freedom and prosperity that would stretch across the Indo-Pacific and draw in the US and Australia more than a decade ago. In 2007, then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe told Indian lawmakers that a broader Asia was beginning to form and implored Delhi to work alongside Tokyo to nurture and enrich these seas. It was the start of what would become the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a loose strategic alliance between the US, Australia, India, and Japan. Abe's attempts to unite Pacific allies came as China was overtaking Japan as the world's second-largest economy. Before long, Beijing was promoting its Belt and Road Initiative to develop new trade routes connecting China with the world. China claims sovereignty almost all of the 1.3 million square mile South China Sea, and has turned multiple reefs and sandbars, far from its shoreline, into man-made artificial islands heavily fortified with missiles, runways, and weapons systems. Observers worried that China's expansion could eventually allow Beijing to control waterways in the South China Sea, threatening the free flow of trade, so in 2016, Abe upgraded his idea and introduced the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Under FOIP, like-minded countries and organizations across Southeast Asia and Africa would safeguard the Indo-Pacific and the trillions of dollars of goods that pass through it each year. Cleo Pascal, an Indo-Pacific strategist at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, said countries were initially slow to catch on to FOIP. Many people didn't think FOIP was even an issue as they assumed the seas would be open and people would be free, she said. But now we're realizing that those two things of being free and open are actually under threat. China's expansion in the region is expected to be one of the main points of discussion when Quad leaders meet in Tokyo on Tuesday, after Kishida's bilateral with Biden. Forging a stronger U.S. security pact. Japan's efforts to unite its democratic allies paid off when the U.S. adopted FOIP in 2017, giving extra clout to the concept along with new resources, programs, and partnerships. But now analysts say the U.S. expects Japan to take on a stronger leadership role in the region, and Tokyo knows that means it needs to step up its defenses. Japan recognizes that if it relies solely on the United States, that wouldn't really sustain the political confidence between the two sides, said Ken Jimbo, a national security expert and professor at Keio University. Last December, Kishida announced the government was exploring options to give Japan the capability to strike enemy bases. Since then, calls have intensified from within Japan's ruling party to develop counterattack capabilities in coordination with the U.S. The move would stretch the limits of the country's pacifist constitution but expand Tokyo's ability to retaliate against mobile and submarine-launched attacks. Japan wants to be able to stand up for itself in a fight. The country has a very strong section of the population who don't want to be reliant on outside powers in order to be able to make decisions that might or may not risk its sovereignty, Pascal said. However, there's resistance within the country to any move away from Japan's pacifist stance. Popular public opinion still views Japan as a pacifist country that shouldn't have the ability to attack others. It should only have sufficient means in order to defend itself, said James Brown, an international relations expert at Temple University. So that concern has made the government move more slowly on this. However, the war in Ukraine seems to be shifting attitudes. A recent poll conducted by Asahi Shimbun and the University of Tokyo showed 64% of 3,000 people surveyed were in favor of Japan strengthening its defensive capabilities, the highest percentage since the survey started in 2003. Managing China's influence. China's support of Russia's actions in Ukraine has strengthened Kishida's mission to protect the integrity of the Indo-Pacific. Not only is he reaching out to larger allies in the US and Europe, he's engaging in diplomacy closer to home to make it clear Japan is a partner that can be relied upon in uncertain times. In March, a Japanese delegation visited the Solomon Islands after China and Honiara signed a security pact that some feared could eventually see a Chinese military base in the Pacific. Pascal, the Indo-Pacific analyst, said the diplomatic trip highlights Tokyo's interest in positioning itself as an alternative security provider. Japan also wants to offer an alternative to China by showcasing its own quality infrastructure projects, which use local labor, have high-quality controls and don't leave unsustainable debt burdens in participating countries, said Thomas Wilkins, a senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Tokyo's efforts have not gone unnoticed in Beijing. During a video call with his Japanese counterpart on Wednesday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that even before Biden's arrival in Asia, the perception that Japan and the US were united against China was already rampant and had created a foul atmosphere, according to a Chinese Foreign Ministry statement. Japan's assertive response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is on brand for a country that's trying to strengthen democratic ties in its own region. When Quad members meet in Tokyo on Tuesday, they'll be looking to present a united front that fits with Japan's original vision of the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity. Pascal said in that regard Japan's leadership in the region was respected and appreciated. There's a lot left to be done, but it is moving in a way that many Japan watchers may not have expected even 5 years ago, she said. Ukraine war, against the thud of artillery, miners struggle on. Then imagine doing that in a war zone. It's scary, but what can you do? We don't have many other options, said Ukrainian nurse Ira Yusko, 30, smiling grimly, as she switched on her headlamp at the Toretsk coal mine in the eastern Donbas region. Around her, more than a dozen miners, their faces already smeared with grime, shuffled forwards in the dark towards a rattling iron elevator that stood waiting to take the group 800 meters underground for a 6-hour shift. We try to be positive. But it's hard on the soul. Depressing. These are terrible times. It's sad at home too. My wife is gone, said Vitaly Vahorder. He spent half his life working at the Toretsk mine. His family recently joined the exodus heading west to safer locations. Outside, the occasional boom and crunch of artillery fire echoed across the wheat fields from the front lines 4 kilometers to the east and south, where Russian troops are struggling to gain ground against fierce Ukrainian resistance in Donbas. People go down the mine knowing they may not come back up. And when you do come back up, anything can happen. The town is constantly being bombed, said Anatoly Shalikov, deputy head of Toretsk's Coal Miners Association, as he watched the elevator door slide shut. The 69-year-old miner was born in the town and was once its mayor. The coal mines, their steep-sided slag heaps dotting the horizon like dark pyramids, have been a defining feature of eastern Ukraine for well over a century. They provided the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, with much of its raw energy. But the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the past 8 years of separatist conflict with pro-Russian militias, and the Kremlin's new offensive have combined to force most of the mines to close. One of many concerns today is that the latest mine closures are happening abruptly, and without proper safety measures, causing old shafts to flood with highly toxic water that threatens to poison local rivers. The danger comes when you stop several mines at once, said Anatoly. You can't control where the groundwater goes. It would be a disaster if it comes to the surface. This whole area would become uninhabitable. So, an ecological crisis looms over our town. May God prevent these mines from stopping. If the work stops and water begins to flood the mines, it could cause a catastrophe. Only 2 mines are still working here in Toretsk, formerly called Dzerzhinsk in honor of the founder of the communist secret police. Driving in from the west, past Ukrainian army checkpoints and roadblocks and into the near-empty town with its Soviet-era architecture and monuments, is like stepping back into the past. A Soviet red star still clings to the top of one of the oldest towers at the Toretsk mine, which first began producing coal in the 1930s, and was badly damaged during World War II. The mine appears to have experienced few improvements, or even licks of paint, since it was refurbished in 1955. One sunny morning last week, staff showed visitors around the site. Giant pieces of rusting machinery sat beside doodle-like swirls of rail track, where a lone female worker was busy pushing mine carts into a wooden shed by hand. 2 giant slag heaps behind the mine were partially covered with trees and undergrowth. A huge tree grew through one ancient winding wheel. Overhead, floorboards creaked ominously as staff walked along a footbridge from the shaft back to the communal shower block, currently without water, like the rest of the town, due to blockages on a nearby canal which locals blamed on the war. There's no water anywhere in this town. You go to the toilet, but how do you flush? When it rains, everyone in our apartment block goes out to collect rainwater, said Vitaly. Only a third of the mine staff have stayed on in the town since the Russian offensive began earlier this year, some out of loyalty to the mine itself, but mostly for financial reasons. I've been working here for 20 years. I went straight to the mines after school. We don't have any other professions here. No factories. We earn 8,000 to 10,000 hryvnias a month, and with the current prices that's nothing, tiny, no better than a student's stipend, said Yuri Podlutsky. As a group, the miners appeared reluctant to pass judgment on the war or President Putin directly. Many of them are Russian-speaking and appeared keen to avoid territory that could cause frictions within a tight-knit community. But several men acknowledged a strong nostalgia for the Soviet era and the times when Ukrainians and Russians worked side by side in the mines. Whether you want Putin or not, we still need to live and work. There are a lot of Soviets here, said Vitaly. I consider myself simply a local. Some of us speak Russian as our first language. But we all share the same sky. It's 7 a.m. in Kiev. Here's what you need to know: more than 1,000 education institutions in Ukraine have been destroyed by Russian forces since the war began, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, with that figure including primary schools, kindergartens, and universities. Here are the latest updates in the war in Ukraine. Russia bans Biden. Russia has banned more than 900 Americans from entering the country, including President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Russia published its updated stop list on Saturday, banning a total of 963 American officials and figures from entering the country. The updated list included the majority of U.S. senators and members of the House of Representatives, former and current government officials, journalists, military personnel, advocates, citizens, CEOs, and even a few deceased individuals. Longtime Arizona. Sen. John McCain and Defense Intelligence Agency Deputy Director Melissa Driscoll, who both died in 2018, were included on the list, as well as Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State under President Donald Trump. Bridge destroyed. Russian forces have destroyed the Pavlograd Bridge between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in Ukraine's Luhansk region, according to Serhiy Haidai, the head of the regional military administration. In a post on his Telegram page on Saturday, Haidai said this will greatly complicate the evacuation and delivery of humanitarian aid, but right now, there is a connection between the cities. Haidai also reported 57 people were evacuated on Saturday from the Luhansk region. Carnage in Lozova. A Russian missile strike on Lozova in the Kharkiv region on Friday damaged more than 1,000 apartments and 11 educational institutions, according to Mayor Serhiy Zelensky. The figures are shocking: 11 educational institutions, including 5 schools. There are questions about the amount of damage suffered by a hospital and a clinic. Our Palace of Culture was completely destroyed too, the mayor said Saturday in a video statement on Telegram. Educational institutions hit. More than 1,000 Ukrainian educational institutions have been destroyed by the Russian army since the start of the war, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Russian army destroyed 1,873 educational institutions. This is a colossal scale of losses, Zelensky said in his nightly address on Saturday. The figure includes primary schools, universities, kindergartens, and other institutes hit by Russian shelling since the war began last February. Donbas offensive. The Russian army has been escalating attacks on Slavyansk and Severodonetsk over the past few days, and the situation in Donbas is now extremely difficult, the Ukrainian president said in his nightly address Saturday. The armed forces of Ukraine are deterring this offensive. Every day that our defenders take away from these offensive plans of Russia, disrupting them, is a concrete contribution to the approach of the main day. The desired day that we are all looking forward to and fighting for, Victory Day, Zelensky said. Azov regiment prisoners could be swapped for oligarch Medvedchuk. Russia's state media Moscow is considering exchanging Ukrainian prisoners from the Azov regiment for Viktor Medvedchuk, a pro-Russian Ukrainian politician and oligarch, according to Russian state media. We will study the matter, Leonid Slutsky, a Russian delegation member for the Ukraine-Russia talks, said during a visit to the occupied city of Donetsk, Russian state-run news agency RIA Novosti reported Saturday. Medvedchuk was detained by Ukrainian authorities in April in a special operation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said earlier this year. Announcing Medvedchuk's detention in April, Zelensky posted a photo of a handcuffed and disheveled-looking Medvedchuk wearing fatigues on Telegram, with the caption, "A special operation was carried out thanks to the SBU. Well done." Prior to Russia's invasion, Medvedchuk had faced allegations of treason in Ukraine and had been under house arrest. His whereabouts had been unknown in the weeks following the invasion. Some observers speculated that Medvedchuk or one of his allies might be the Kremlin's preference to lead a puppet government in Ukraine if the February 24 invasion succeeded in toppling Zelensky. Ukraine war, what might tip the balance? Russia's war in Ukraine has become an increasingly grinding and bloody affair, with each side wearing the other down. Both claim to have made recent gains. But they've also suffered setbacks. Overall, Russia is still the dominant force and has significant military might, but there has been no swift victory as planned. Here, we take a closer look at some of the things which could tilt the outcome in favor of either party. Gains and losses. In the north, a Ukrainian counteroffensive has successfully pushed back Russian forces from the city of Kharkiv. In the south, Russia has all but cleared out the final pockets of resistance in the port city of Mariupol. Both have been costly in terms of military and civilian casualties, but neither is likely to prove decisive. What's happened in Mariupol and Kharkiv highlights the ebb and flow of this conflict. That pattern of costly gains and losses is now being repeated in the east of the country. Russia has been making small but steady advances in the Donbass, the renewed focus of its offensive. But it's also suffered setbacks, as highlighted by the destruction earlier this month of dozens of Russian armored vehicles trying to cross the Seversky Donets River. Russia's advantage, artillery in the east, each side is exchanging heavy, grinding blows using artillery. Ben Berry, a former British Army brigadier who is now with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, says that will continue to be the case in the Battle of the Donbass. He predicts artillery will be the main cause of casualties on both sides for weeks and months to come. Western officials have highlighted significant Russian losses, but they have been less willing to give estimates of Ukrainian casualties. Ukraine is now receiving Western-supplied heavy weapons, including US M777 howitzers. It has also been sent counter-artillery radar systems to help find and target Russia's artillery lines. But Ukraine is still outgunned. Tactics. Russia has been using its artillery and rocket launchers to tie down Ukrainian forces who are dug in, along well-prepared defensive lines. Russia has been pressing from two main directions, from Izium in the north and from the west around the city of Severodonetsk. They have made limited advances in both directions. Brig Berry says it appears that Russia is trying to bleed Ukraine dry by forcing it to concentrate its forces at key points, which can then be targeted by its artillery. Military analysts believe Ukraine is likely to have suffered significant casualties as a result. However, he says Ukraine will still be able to use urban areas in the Donbass to slow down Russia's advances. Fighting in town and cities, as has been shown throughout this war, favors the defender. Once again, as in Mariupol, Russia is likely to try to grind resistance down, with the now familiar pattern of using mass artillery strikes until there remains little to defend. Ukraine's President Zelensky has already said Ukraine's eastern Donbass region has been completely destroyed, and has described life there as hell. It's going to get worse. Russia's Frankenstein forces military experts though still believe that Russia lacks the number of troops it needs to make significant advances in the east. Redeploying forces from the fight in Kharkiv and Mariupol is unlikely to make a difference. Jack Wadling, of the Royal United Services Institute, says Russia is still short of manpower and in particular infantry. Russia has tried to reconstruct and combine some of its already battered units, dubbed Frankenstein's forces. Unit cohesion and morale of tired and depleted units is likely to be poor. A recent UK Ministry of Defence intelligence assessment concluded that Russian commanders were facing pressure to achieve results quickly and as a result were likely to redistribute forces without adequate preparation. The ministry said that risked further attrition. It is already claimed that Russia has already lost around a third of its original invasion force, an estimate that includes killed and wounded troops as well as equipment destroyed or damaged. In maps, Russia making small gains in eastern Ukraine war could cause global food crisis. UN Mr. Wadling says Russia is trying to address these shortages, including mobilizing reserves who are over 40 years old and offering short-term contracts to fill its ranks. But training and rebuilding an army takes time. Russia has also proved vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks on its supply lines. But Ukraine's capacity to do this is likely to be limited with the bulk of its forces tied down in defensive positions. The long war. No one thinks this war will be over quickly. It's not yet a stalemate. Russia is making advances, but very slowly. But the outcome of this war is unlikely to depend on military might alone. Mr. Wadling says Russia is also pursuing economic and political levers to inflict as much damage on Ukraine as possible. While Russia's economy is taking a hit from Western sanctions, Ukraine's is likely to suffer even more. Russia's GDP is expected to shrink by 12% over the next year, but Ukraine's GDP could fall by 50%. Russia's blockade of the Black Sea is causing significant damage. Mr. Wadling says continuing Western economic, as well as military, support could prove crucial. Will the public's interest in the war wane the longer it goes on, just as it did after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and Russian-backed separatists first seized parts of the Donbass? Western governments now also have to worry about their own domestic challenges, including rising inflation, gas and oil prices, and a cost of living crisis, caused in part by the war. When winter approaches, it will be harder for armies to fight. It may also prove more difficult for the world to weather an economic storm. Polish president to address Ukraine's parliament. Poland's President Andrzej Duda has arrived in Ukraine, his office said Sunday. Duda will deliver a speech to Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, as the first foreign head of state to address the council since the war began, the president's office said in a statement. It didn't give details on the timing of his remarks. Ukraine's natural environment is another casualty of war. The damage could be felt for decades. Irpin, Ukraine. The pine forests around Irpin are Oli Bondarenko's happy place. He discovered them as a child, when his mom sent him to the area for summer camp, and he has been coming back ever since. It's a place full of memories. Vorzel, Irpin, Bucha, the forests, the fresh air. For me, this is a place of respite, the 64-year-old environmental scientist told CNN during a recent trip to Irpin. The hour-long journey from Kiev, a trip he has made many times over the decades, was filled with anguish for Bondarenko, who worried what he would find in Irpin. This is the first time I am coming back since our brothers visited Irpin, he said, referring to Russian troops. This area was under Russian control for several weeks in March. It has subsequently become known around the world as the site of some of the worst atrocities committed by Russia in this war. At least 1,200 bodies of civilians have been discovered in the region since Russian troops withdrew from there, according to the Kiev Region Police. At least 290 of them were found in Irpin, according to the city's mayor. In addition to the human toll, the destruction Russian forces caused to the landscape here is brutal and omnipresent: scorched earth, forest floors ravaged by missiles, and trees broken down and uprooted, while abandoned military equipment litters the ground. Many of the town's neat houses lie in ruins, the woodland and green spaces around them are off limits. Anzelika Kolomiak, Bondarenko's friend who lives in Irpin, told CNN the authorities have banned people from going into the woods. We have a beautiful forest here, but this year there won't be any walks, there won't be any mushroom picking, there won't be berries. We are not allowed to go in because of mines and unexploded missiles, she said. While the world's eyes are focused on the human suffering brought about by Russia's invasion, environmental experts in Ukraine are keeping a close record of the environmental damage it has caused, to try to repair it as soon as possible, and in hopes of extracting reparations. The mined and destroyed forest in Irpin is just one example of the environmental damage caused by Russia's war on Ukraine. Satellite images show large swaths of eastern and southern Ukraine are currently engulfed in wildfires sparked by explosions and made worse by the fact that emergency services, forest management workers and the army are unable to get to them. The smoke from the fires is polluting the air. Ukraine's fertile soil is becoming contaminated with heavy metals and other potentially poisonous substances leaking from missiles, military equipment, and spent ammunition. Spilled fuel is polluting groundwaters and ecosystems are being hammered by tanks and other heavy technology. All of this is damage that will be felt for decades after the war ends. Most people may not see nature as a priority, at least not right now, when Ukraine's future is at stake and people are dying every day amid the conflict. When you see the crimes against humanity, the unbelievable atrocities, people being killed, tortured, raped, hundreds of them, it is natural not to think about environmental impacts, said Natalia Gozak, executive director of the Center for Environmental Initiatives in Kiev. So it's our task to pay attention and ensure that these types of crimes are also considered as a crime and that the Russians pay for everything, not only for killing people, but also for killing our future and impacting our future well-being. Gathering evidence. Bondarenko took part in the battle for Kiev in March. He and his son joined the Territorial Defense Force, the mostly volunteer section of Ukraine's armed forces, in the first days of the war. He has now been released from duty because of his age and is slowly returning to his environmental work. He wants Ukraine to be ready to start rebuilding in a smart, sustainable way when the war ends. We are faced with a much larger crisis now and have to put everything else aside, although I think very soon we will return to the environmental agenda and we have to start thinking about that now, he said. Experts like Bondarenko and Gozak are also trying to raise awareness of the risk stemming from the environmental damage. Bondarenko is a nuclear physicist by training and has spent a large part of his career working on environmental safety in the Chernobyl zone. The risk of nuclear pollution is high on everyone's mind after Russian troops entered Chernobyl and targeted Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia in southern Ukraine. Wim Zwijnenberg, the leader of the humanitarian disarmament project at PAX, a Dutch peace organization, said international organizations are starting to pay more attention to the environmental damage caused by armed conflicts. What we saw in Iraq and Syria is that environmental pollution caused by the war can pose acute risks to the health of people, he said. But no one was paying attention to it. Everyone thought the environment is something for tree huggers and people who like bees and butterflies, but then the reality on the ground was that people, and particularly children, can be exposed to toxic remnants of war, all kinds of chemical materials from bombs and factories, or other kinds of hazardous chemicals. Because of these past experiences, environmental scientists and humanitarian organizations have started building and using databases of sites that are known to contain hazardous materials. Now, when they receive information about an attack, they can cross-check the database to estimate an impact on the surrounding ecosystems. The Center for Environmental Initiatives has built an interactive map of incidents across Ukraine, breaking them down by the type of damage, including nuclear and chemical pollution, dangerous livestock waste and degradation of land and marine ecosystems. During these massive attacks, tons of toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, including uranium, get into the soil, said Olena Kravchenko, Executive Director of Environment People Law, an environmental think tank in Lviv. She said the huge amounts of missiles, explosives, and other types of weapons and discarded military technology used in war are not the only cause of pollution. Mass burials conducted without consideration for environmental safety can also cause long-term groundwater and soil contamination. Ukraine has accused Russia of burying bodies in hastily dug mass graves to cover up war crimes. The shared monitoring system can also help set priorities in situations where resources are extremely limited. Most environmental damage can be addressed after the conflict, but there's that 5 to 10% where you need to send in experts because there are certain types of chemicals where you need experts to clean it up and not people who don't know so much about it, Zwijnenberg said. Sometimes, the damage may not be immediately obvious. When the Ukrainian army shot down a Russian missile flying over the Kremenets district in western Ukraine last month, some of the debris fell on an agricultural facility, according to the Ternopil Regional State Administration. The impact site was cleaned up within a few hours, but the poisonous substances that leaked during the incident lingered in the soil and water for days, according to State Ecological Inspectorate of Policia District. People in the surrounding villages were told not to drink water from their wells, and a few days after the incident, dead fish were reportedly discovered in a river several miles away. When the State Ecological Inspectorate of Policia District measured the ammonium levels in the river, it found that they were 163 times higher than what is considered safe. Animal populations, too, are suffering as a result of the conflict. Experts say the unique habitats on the coast of the Azov Sea in southern Ukraine are being irreparably degraded as Russia continues to pound the area with missiles and bombs. Precious perennial forests and salt marshes in the Kinban Spit Reserve in the Mykolaiv region were on fire for more than a week. Its unique habitats were left devastated, according to Zinovy Petrovich, the head of Kinban Spit Reserve. Petrovich told CNN that the fires were sparked by exploding rockets. He said continued shelling in the area makes it difficult to extinguish the fires. Another reason is a lack of equipment and the shortage of fuel for fire trucks, he said. The Tuzli Lagoons National Nature Park near Odessa is usually a haven for dozens of bird species that go there to nest. This year, most weren't able to do that. Ivan Rusiev, a biologist and the head of the scientific department of the park, told CNN. Rusiev estimates Russian troops have dropped around 200 bombs on the park. All living beings feel the impact of this aggressive war, he said, adding that the few birds that have managed to have chicks are now unable to feed them properly. The area is famous for its white and Dalmatian pelicans, Rusiev said, with a peacetime population of about 1,500. Now there are only a handful of birds, he said. Rusiev said that the sudden increase in warship and submarine numbers in the Black Sea is causing further harm. We found dead dolphins on the shore killed by the low-frequency sonars, he said. Hoping for reparations. Environmental scientists and activists are already gathering evidence of the damage inflicted on nature by the war, hoping to use it in the future. When we triumphantly defeat, we will be able to count the real damage and present it to the barbarians who treacherously attacked us, Rusiev said. An environmental NGO, Save Dnipro, has built a chatbot software that simulates human-to-human conversation, to make it easier to access data on pollution and to report suspected environmental war crimes. They are compiling the list and fact-checking against open sources, but the verification and proper investigation will be up to the authorities. But getting war reparations for ecological damage is a tall order. Zwijnenberg said that under current international law, the bar is really high. To reach the threshold where governments can be held accountable for environmental damage, it needs to be severe, long-term damage to the environment before you can actually say it's a war crime. And the only time this bar or the threshold has been crossed was in 1991, when Iraq set fire to hundreds of oil wells in Kuwait, he said. The United Nations Compensation Commission ordered Iraq to pay Kuwait roughly $3 billion for the environmental damage it caused during the 1990 invasion as part of its $52.4 billion war reparations package. Many activists are also worried about further damage being caused unnecessarily in the name of the war effort. An investigation conducted by the European Union in 2017 and 2018 into Ukraine's forestry sector said its forest control system was not functioning properly. That report, published in 2020, found that evidence from the ground points to a culture of widespread corruption and illegal logging. Ukrainian national watchdogs have largely suspended their environmental protection work because of the war. Kravchenko told CNN that could lead to national resources being exploited. We know Ukrainian foresters are cutting down the forest and the explanation is that it's for the needs of the army. But is it for the needs of the army or for the needs of the corruption that exists in the forest industry? The environment suffers hits from all sides, she said. Back in Irpin, nature is slowly fighting back. Next to the wreck of a burnt-out Russian armored vehicle, green shoots are beginning to emerge on a damaged tree. The lilac bushes standing outside homes along the road through the forest are bursting with color. The huge exodus of people from the capital, combined with acute shortages of fuel mean that, paradoxically, air quality in the region is now better than it has been in years. Nature is, as we say, the poor sister, Bondarenko said. We think of nature last. First of all, we think about our lives and about the lives of our loved ones and our friends and other people, then we think about our homes and jobs, and so on, and then, at the end of the list, we think about nature. I believe we have a chance, despite the war, to make cardinal changes in our attitude towards nature, environmental protection, energy, and our use of green resources, he added. The town of Irpin takes its name from the Irpin River, which meanders through the region before flowing into the Dnipro. The river played an important role in the defense of Kiev, Bondarenko said. Our armed forces blew up bridges and were forced to open dams to flood the Irpin riverbed to stop the invaders from crossing it on pontoon bridges and coming to Kiev.